Money Radio, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Pleasure to welcome Woody Brock, President and founder of Strategic Economic Decisions, Inc., a firm that provides economic and financial market analysis to financial institutions, corporations, and investors. He is also a writer and has written multiple articles and a new book called American Gridlock: Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong. Common Sense 101 Solutions to the Economic Crisis. American Gridlock by Woody Brock, who joins us today. Woody, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I think the book tries to address a few different areas, has a few different goals, but really it boils down to, I think, upon reviewing it, there's the idea of identifying some problems in the body politic, but really it comes down to a different way of thinking, deductive logic, which is not so popular anymore. Explain what it is and why you feel it's so important.
Well, here we go. Let's look at it backwards. The various polls that you see show the American people are more fed up with gridlock than almost anything else. That is to say, they know Washington is not working, it's broken, problems are not being fixed. Would you agree?
Yes.
And one of the reasons they blame is this left-right, impasse, shouting matches on CNBC versus Fox or the New York Times versus the Wall Street Journal. Everything's predictable. You're left to right. So it's a logjam. The problem is we have issues so important we got to solve them, like avoiding bankruptcy in Medicare and salvaging this lost decade where the correct unemployment rate is still 15% as measured by the government's U6 measure. We got to deal with stuff. So what do? My logic here has been to use, my approach has been to arrive at what I'm going to call win-win solutions to these policy problems that have nothing to do with left or right. So no one has to worry about their ox being gored by the other party. You transcend that stale issue, and you arrive at higher-level win-win strategies. And the way you can do this, and the only way you can do this, is to use basically better forms of thinking. For example, you may have remembered the book, The Beautiful Mind, the movie with Russell Crowe about John Nash.
Yes.
My teacher. Other people like this gave us new ways of thinking. In this case, it was called game theory. Then at Harvard and Stanford, the economics of uncertainty, new concepts of supply and demand. So what I do is I take these new forms of logic, which have very little to do with data crunching, and I use the new forms of logic to show you can arrive at win-win solutions that bypass the left and the right argument. And in that way, you can basically break American gridlock.
The left and the right argument you define as the dialogue of the deaf. How did you come up with that?
Well, I think at one point I called it the deafening dialogue of the deaf. This becomes so screechy and so ridiculous. Well, because when you know that no one's going to change side, that you're going to keep to your left-wing views and right-wing views. And this is incidentally a good point to back up what I just said about the usefulness of deduction versus so-called induction, where you just use data to prove what you want to prove. Suppose you're left-wing and I'm right-wing, and we're going on TV tonight at 8 o'clock, okay?
Okay.
You have your views, and the audience knows you're left-wing. You're labeled. There's a big label in your forehead. What do? You call up some experts to get some more facts to back you up, correct?
Yeah.
So they go pick some facts to back up your left-wing view. It's known as a prejudice, a prejudgment. I, on the right, who I'm going to debate you, will call up the Heritage Foundation, which is right-wing, and get some new factoids to back up my view. Well, the result is that the audience watching sees an even more shrill debate than ever before. There's no progress. No one gets anywhere. Nothing's resolved. This is the use of data, cherry-picked data, simply to back up pre-existing prejudices. It's sometimes called bastardized induction. It's not helpful. It doesn't come up with answers. So I hope that's partially what I'm getting at here.
How do we arrive at answers through deductive logic?
Well, that's what the book is about, and that's what's innovative. If you, for example, take the issue of the lost decade that we're in right now, where the growth of the economy, while it's recovering, is far too low to rehire the workers that were fired in the great financial crisis, much less to hire each year all the new graduates from school and immigrants. Usually, historically, we had a 6.5% spurt of growth for a couple of years after a recession. That spurt of growth made it possible to rehire you and me after we were fired. We have to grow at 3% every year to hire all the new people who come out of school.
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't noticed, for 3 years we've been growing at about 2.3%.
Yes, and
so
it hasn't been enough.
Really,
hasn't been enough to make up for the lost jobs.
Absolutely. Now, how do you use deductive logic? Suppose you want to solve a real problem. The problem is, Mr. President, what are we going to do here? Here's what we want, Mr. President. We want to create a lot of jobs and accelerate GDP growth, correct? Yes.
Right.
We also want to raise national productivity because that's what causes growth in living standards. I mean, your dog knows that. Good. We want to put people back to work. And the problem, Mr. President, of course, is the private sector. Animal spirits are pretty bad. No one wants new McMansions anymore. There's no Bill Gates revolution going on. So you're not going to get the growth you need and put people back to work from the private sector. So the government has to be involved. But wait a minute. Mr. Brock, are you saying the government has to spend more money and have more red ink? I mean, we all know deficits have to come down, not go up. Mr. Brock, what are you talking about? And the answer is, if you use very advanced deductive logic, worked out originally by a great Nobel Prize winner, that in fact the word deficit has no meaning. It's a bad word, and it's basically just ruined debate on this issue. Suppose you do borrow more money, but you only invest it in infrastructure projects that make lots of money. Heard of the Louisiana Purchase?
Oh, yes.
In 1807, when we spent $17 million to buy all the land west of the Mississippi?
That would be good debt.
Well, the rate of return on that borrowed money was about more than Steve Jobs made in his lifetime. IBID the intercontinental railroads, IBID the interstate highway system that had a 13% rate of return on capital. So the fear of deficits being bad is correct. If you do what we've been doing and run up bad deficits by borrowing money, not investing it, but rather just spending it on income maintenance, interest rate on the debt, and defense, which is what we've been doing, the borrowed money is just debt that has to be paid off by our kids, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And the world watching this, the so-called bond market seeing this, says, wait a minute. These kids may one day say, hell no, we won't pay. So that's the end, and then people won't lend you money except at much higher interest rates, and you go down the drain. So the point here is using the correct logical approach, which recognizes that there are ways government can borrow and spend money that not only, they're wonderful for the economy, because they're just what we need. We haven't put a new roof in the house in 50 years. But in addition, the bond market says, bravo. We don't mind. This is not borrowed. This doesn't end up in the lap of the kids. This is going to pay for itself, the way the interstate highway system did, not to mention the Internet, which the government still owns. So this is my point here. By properly thinking through things like the word deficit, you can do a much better job of clarifying the issues. And the result, Mr. President, is we have a new roof on the house. We haven't invested in infrastructure in 50 years. We've raised productivity. Unlike when you borrow money and just spend it on keeping you and me in our jobs, Nancy Pelosi style, which creates no new jobs, you agree?
Mm-hmm.
This time when you borrow, say $1 trillion, the money goes to a master contractor who's in charge of electric grids and this and that and everything else, who'll keep 5% for rainy day, and he'll hand out all the rest of the money to 15 contractors, correct?
Yes.
Each of them will keep 5% of the money for rainy day and hire 181 subcontractors. You're creating jobs galore. So, Mr. President, we create jobs, we raise productivity, we put a new roof in the house, we put people back to work, and the bond market loves us. That is the kind of example in the book.
Seems to me we've seen
thinking.
variations of this at various times. You can go back to the works projects of FDR or to the Marshall Plan in Europe.
Absolutely correct. The difference was we did not at that time have the full understanding that we now have as to how to pick things. I mean, look, there's 19 bullet trains have been proposed. What my new investment bank would do is to say, put people to work who have no political bias and just evaluate which ones are going to make a minus 6% rate of return, which are plus 6, allowing for error and risk and all of that. The Marshall Plan, that wasn't necessary. There we just had to do something to turn Germany and France into allies against Russia on the Cold War. But this time around, and what you missed is that in the past when we've done this, we didn't have the bond market vigilantes staring at us, worried that America is going bankrupt. There was never an issue before. We didn't have $50 trillion of unfunded liabilities the way we now have. Do you see the difference?
Certainly.
So this time we really have to focus not on the government doing investments, but doing investments that are certified profitable. That's the difference.
Now, you've brought up some very interesting ideas in the book American Gridlock, but one of the more interesting you saved for the end. And this was something that I think, didn't you work on this as a thesis, you said, in your college years?
The whole question of fair shares and justice. And this was my great passion and my work earlier in my life. When at Princeton I did my PhD thesis. Yes, I did.
So
And
distributive...
incidentally, I once upon a time thought this was interesting, I love this, but you can't make a living thinking about these problems. The public doesn't care. Boy, has that changed. Right now, that's issue number one around the world.
Absolutely.
Even in China, fair shares. And the feeling that we're not being fairly that the game is rigged. And it doesn't matter if you occupy Wall Street or if you're just a normal person. Everyone has the sense it's rigged. And that's unfair. So I do talk about that a lot in the last part of the book.
It is rigged, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's rigged in many ways. I mean, you're never going to have equality of outcome in life. You're not going to be as tall as I am or as ugly as I am or any of that stuff. But there used to be this sense that, if you worked real hard at a public high school and got very good grades, you went to apply to Harvard, you got in. It didn't matter you didn't have a rich daddy, the way suppose I did. You got it on merit, because Harvard had a $28 billion endowment to make sure that no one asked the question, can you afford it? That sense is going away now. The state universities are no longer giving their slots available to people who live in that state. They'll sell it to Asians for who'll pay down cash. So there's a sense that the equality of opportunity is eroding rapidly, which has a lot to do with the pessimism of the middle class towards the hollowing out of the middle class, which is really scary and is going on right this minute.
That was an important distinction that you made there, equality of opportunity.
Yes.
Make of it
versus
what you will.
Equality of outcome.
Yes.
Yeah, equality of outcome is when you sort of take everyone's money and everybody ends up with $2,000 in their bank accounts, and that's it. Equality of opportunity means if a talented young guy with no money named Stephen Jobs has aptitude and talent, he's able to go to school and get the tools he needs. Depriving kids of ability and motivation with the opportunities to be a Steve Jobs or whatever, it's what's going on right now, and I'm very mad about that.
What might an ideal political economy consist of?
Well, I'm writing about that right now, and that's also in the last part of the book. It's an extremely deep question, and I think you have to think of sort of a threesome. A good economy has to have an economy, a polity, and a constitution. By that I mean, an economy is the system where you go look at prices and decide what to have for dinner. It's about markets and prices. Then you have to have a legislative process that deals with things like providing public goods that markets can't deal with, regulating monopolists in markets when they arise, protecting civil rights, habeas corpus, free rights to vote, all those things we take for granted in America. You have to have a government that makes political decisions, but it has to be constrained by a constitution that says even if you have majority rule, no matter how much of a majority you have, you cannot take Woody Brock off in the middle of the night and cart him off into prison. He has rights that are guaranteed by a constitution that is very hard to change. Most countries don't have this, incidentally. We do. The Founding Fathers were brilliant about the checks and balances. So the next question, to answer your question, is, okay, what's a good economy, what's a good political system, and what's a good constitution, and what do those words even mean? And that is the next level of issue. But, we could go on about this till the cows come in.
But hang on just a moment, because we don't have until the cows come in. We'll take a quick break here. We'll continue on with the conversation, though. We take a quick break, and we will continue with our guest today, Woody Brock. He is the author of American Gridlock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong. American Gridlock. It's a new look at deductive logic and the difference that can make on the dialogue. Our guest, Woody Brock, American Gridlock on Money Radio. We'll continue in just a moment. Money Radio, we're back with our guest, Woody Brock, the author of American Gridlock, Why the Left and Right Are Both Wrong, Common Sense 101, and there has been a dearth of common sense, it seems, for quite some time, as we look at the issues that are really important for America moving forward. And, of course, part of that is distributive justice. What is the system that's going to work best? And as we look at that, we have to look at capitalism, and it seems that the idea of capitalism, Woody, is misinterpreted. Some people think it's the free market with the invisible hand, to borrow the phrase from Adam Smith, with no government intervention, but really that's not it at all.
No, Adam Smith understood in order to have a free market system where it worked, which is wonderful. Nothing beats the market in that sense. That's 14 Nobel Prizes. But to have it, Adam Smith even recognized back when he first wrote about this, you can't have a market system unless you have judges that cannot be bribed, courts of law, and an army to keep out the Huns, correct?
Correct.
These are known as public goods. Goods the market itself won't provide. Government has to. So in order to have capitalism, you have to have government. But wait a minute. If we have to have an army and law courts and some judges, who's going to pay the bill? So from the beginning, you had to deal with what's a fair way of sharing the cost of providing the public goods needed for there to be, quote, capitalism. So people who think that you don't have to deal with anything like fair shares and fair tax rates are wrong. It's fundamental that you do have to deal with them. And the good news is you can have fair tax rates and you can work on that problem without in any way compromising the market system itself. This is a very important point people do not understand. They're separate things. So you can have a flat tax, you can have a progressive one, but in both cases, the market will work well. And the question then becomes, what's a better and more fair system? And most people for 300 years have agreed with the English utilitarians that if you have $10,000 a year, you should not be paying the same percentage of your income as somebody with $1 million a year. It's much more difficult for you to raise 10% for the government than it is from a person with $1 million a year.
The book American Gridlock, we've talked about distributive justice, we've talked about deductive logic, but really you then apply it to some of the more pressing issues of the day. For example, the sky-high unemployment, the economic growth that we've seen over this past decade, a lost decade.
And really the Medicare crisis is the most important.
Huge. Medicare and entitlements, and also Social Security. You dig into that one. Also taking a look at China and intellectual property theft and currency manipulation.
Oh, unbelievable.
And then one...
I mean, I was just there last week, and they're all complaining about it, even in the country.
And then a huge one was the financial markets and the possibility of, almost the inevitability at this point, I would say, of another bubble forming based upon, in large part, leverage.
Yes. The people who now contribute so much to campaigns and who have incomes of 25, 50, 100 million a year, these very rich financiers, have such incomes because they're leveraged much more than ever before in history. Leverage means huge money. The problem is, Adam Smith wouldn't mind if you and I started a firm and leveraged it up to the sky, provided that if something went wrong, we didn't hurt other people. The problem is John Meriwether with long-term capital nearly brought down the whole system. This is absolutely scandalous. They should not be allowed to have this kind of leverage. And if the result is their incomes fall back to $5 million a year, well, I'm not going to shed crocodile tears. Leverage is bad when it's excessive, and we know how to measure when it's excessive.
The book is entitled American Gridlock. The author is Woody Brock, Why the Right and Left Are Both Wrong. And it raises some really interesting questions and has some intriguing answers as well, brought to us by deductive logic, not by prejudice. So very interesting in that regard. Woody, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.